Hello, welcome to another episode of History in the Dark. I am your host, Darkness the Curse. And before we begin, as always, thank you so much to my generous patrons, my British rail critics, and of course, my underwater train finders. You are the reason why this content remains! Pride of a nation, a beast made of steel! Bismarck in motion! King of the ocean, he was made to rule the waves across the seven seas! To lead the war machine, to rule the waves and lead the Kriegsmarine! I've gotten a lot of requests to talk about the Bismarck, and it's a pretty well-known story from World War II, so it's usually not what I deal with. But so many people have asked me, why not? I will preface this with the fact that I am 100% confident in the notion that my video on this won't be as detailed as other videos that have done on this. There are some videos about the Bismarck that are over an hour and a half long, going into all the specifics surrounding the ship, as well as her first and final voyage. But I'm going to give you the abridged version and tell you everything you really need to know about this incredible piece of battleship technology. Laid down on the 1st of July 1936 by Nazi Germany and launched on the 14th of February 1939, the Bismarck was first commissioned on the 24th of August 1940. She and her sister ship Tirpitz were the largest battleships ever built by Germany, and they were two of the largest built by any European power. However, the Bismarck would only last 8 months, but not necessarily anything to do with anything wrong with her. A lot of her weaknesses that many people have pointed out are weaknesses that a lot of other battleships also have. The Bismarck just found herself in a really terrible situation and under really questionable mission parameters given to her by the Kriegsmarine, which was the German Navy. Now, I've already stressed that the Bismarck was huge, and she was. She displaced 41,700 tons, as built, and 50,300 tons fully loaded. Her overall length was 251 meters, or 823 feet 6 inches. She had a beam of 36 meters, and a maximum draft of 9.9 meters. To move this massive armored vessel, she was powered by 3 Blohm Voss geared steam turbines, as well as 12 oil-fired Wagner superheated boilers. This actually enabled her to reach a max speed of 30.01 knots, which is about 55 kilometers an hour, or 34 miles per hour, which is not that bad for a ship that big. As a battleship, naturally, she had guns. She was armed with 8 38-centimeter SK C/34 guns, which were arranged in 4 twin gun turrets. 2 forward, who were named Anton and Bruno, and 2 aft, known as Caesar and Dora. She had a wide array of secondary armament, as well as 12 2-centimeter anti-aircraft guns. Her armor was actually ludicrous. Her main belt was 320 millimeters, that's 12.6 inches thick, and that was covered by a pair of upper and main armored decks. On the 16th of May, 1941, Bismarck, as well as the heavy cruiser Prince Eugen, were all geared up for a top-secret operation, Operation Rheinenbund, which I'm hopefully saying correctly. The mission involved a breakout procedure moving past the Royal Navy's main area of defense, and both ships were to push out into the Atlantic Ocean. The point of this was not necessarily to engage the Royal Navy directly. The plan was to interrupt the supply line between North America and the UK. Both Canada and the United States had been sending supplies to the UK to keep them fueled up. Part of the reason the UK was able to keep fighting the good fight was because of the food, munitions, and everything the North American nations were sending them. The Germans obviously wanted to interrupt the supply line, and having something like the Bismarck sitting in the middle of the Atlantic would make getting merchant ships through a little more complicated for the Allies. However, when Hitler was notified about the plan, he actually didn't like it at all. He was a big fan of battleships, and he loved the Bismarck. He was terrified the pride of the German Navy would be lost doing something that could be accomplished by U-boats. The Kriegsmarine assured him that, no, it'll be fine. It's totally fine. I promise. What could possibly go wrong here? So Hitler reluctantly accepted the plan, although things kind of went wrong almost immediately. The Germans encountered a Swedish cruiser named Gotland, which did not have the firepower to actually confront them, but did shadow them for 2 hours in the Kattegat. Gotland transmitted the information about this flotilla to their headquarters. However, the Kriegsmarine wasn't actually concerned about the security risks, not believing a simple Swedish cruiser would compromise the operation. Again, this was top secret. They weren't supposed to actually be found out. Admiral Gunther Lütjens, as well as the captain of the Bismarck, Otto Ernst Lindemann, didn't actually agree with the Kriegsmarine regarding the situation. They were convinced that operational secrecy had been lost, and in fairness, they were absolutely correct. The British naval attaché in Sweden transmitted this information back to the Admiralty, and codebreakers confirmed the information as factual. An Atlantic raid was imminent, and the Bismarck and the Prinz Eugen would be involved. A search was launched to locate exactly where the ships were. This consisted of 2 Supermarine Spitfires. The Germans, for their part, did keep aerial reconnaissance over the UK, and they did notice that over in Scapa Flow, there was still 1 aircraft carrier, 3 battleships, and 4 cruisers remaining at anchor. Because of this, they didn't actually think the British were aware of the operation. They were. The flotilla reached the Norwegian coast on the 20th of May. The minesweepers they had with them were detached, and the 2 raiders and their destroyer escorts continued north. They docked briefly, and during this time, the Bismarck was spotted again by Flying Officer Michael Suckling, who flew his Spitfire directly over the German flotilla at a height of 8,000 meters, or 26,000 feet, despite the fact that Bf-109 fighters circled overhead specifically to protect the Bismarck from exactly this sort of thing. When they received information that confirmed their fears, Admiral John Tovey ordered the battlecruiser HMS Hood, as well as the newly commissioned battleship HMS Prince of Wales, as well as 6 destroyers, to reinforce the pair of cruisers that were patrolling the Denmark Strait. The rest of the home fleet was placed on high alert, still in Scapa Flow, and 18 bombers were dispatched to attack the Germans, but weather over the fjord had taken a turn for the worse, and they weren't able to find the warships. And at 19:30 hours on the 21st of May, Bismarck and Prinz Eugen and their 3 destroyer escorts left Bergen and continued heading up towards the North Sea and towards their mission objective out in the Atlantic. By 400 hours on the 23rd of May, Lütjens ordered Bismarck and Prinz Eugen to increase speed to 27 knots, or 50 kilometers or 31 miles an hour, to get through the Denmark Strait as quickly as possible. When they entered the strait, both ships activated their FUMO radar detection equipment sets. The sea was very treacherous, as they encountered ice and had to zigzag around it. That's when they encountered a cruiser, HMS Suffolk, at a range of approximately 12,500 meters. Prinz Eugen's radio intercept team decrypted the radio signals that were sent from Suffolk and revealed to the Germans, finally confirming that their location had been reported. Lütjens gave permission for Prinz Eugen to engage the Suffolk, but her captain didn't actually fire. He couldn't clearly make out his target, so he didn't want to waste the shot. Suffolk was able to retreat to a safe distance and began to shadow the German ships. At 20:30, the heavy cruiser HMS Norfolk joined Suffolk in this particular activity, but they got a bit too close to the German raiders. Lütjens ordered his ships to engage her, and Bismarck fired 5 salvos, 3 of which straddled Norfolk and rained shell splinters onto her decks. The cruiser was able to lay a smoke screen and ran away into a fog bank. It was at this point that there was a design flaw revealed with the Bismarck. Admittedly, it was something that probably could have been fixed, but her 38cm guns, yeah, their concussion actually disabled her FUMO 23 radar set. This wasn't a major issue at the time, though. Prinz Eugen was ordered to take station ahead so she could use her functioning radar, while Bismarck followed behind. At about 2200 hours, Lütjens was having just about enough of being followed by these 2 cruisers, so he ordered Bismarck to make a sudden 180-degree turn in an effort to surprise them. Bismarck was actually visually obscured in a rain squall, so she couldn't be seen, but Suffolk's radar revealed the maneuver, which allowed the cruisers to evade her. Suffolk and Norfolk remained on station throughout the night, continually relaying the location of the flotilla, and when the harsh weather broke on the morning of the 24th of May, at 5:07, the hydrophone operators aboard Prinz Eugen detected a pair of unidentified vessels approaching the German formation. At 5:45 on the 24th of May, German lookouts spotted smoke on the horizon. Eventually it was realized that this was HMS Hood and HMS Prince of Wales. Lutyens ordered his ship's crews to battle stations, and by 5:52, the range between the vessels had fallen to 26,000 meters, close enough that the Hood opened fire, followed by Prince of Wales just a minute later. Hood was focusing on Prince Eugen, not because she wasn't supposed to be shooting at Bismarck, they just got them mixed up for whatever reason. Prince of Wales, however, did fire on Bismarck. Adalbert Schneider, who was the first gunnery officer aboard Bismarck, twice requested permission to return fire, but Lutyens, for whatever reason, was hesitating. He may have been conflicted because the Kriegsmarine's direct orders were not for this flotilla to engage actual battleships. They were supposed to avoid this kind of engagement. But in this situation, they really didn't have much of a choice. Lindemann, absolutely not willing to lose his ship, demanded permission to fire, and Lutyens finally relented. At 5:55, he ordered the ships to engage the British. The positioning of the ships is relevant to the engagement, as the British were actually approaching head-on, and this meant they could only use their forward guns. Bismarck and Prince Eugen were more vulnerable as they were sideways, but this meant that they could fire back with full broadsides. Several minutes after opening fire, Vice Admiral Lancelot Holland ordered a 20-degree turn to port, which would allow Prince of Wales and Hood to actually use their rear guns. Both of the German ships opted to fire on Hood specifically, and after about a minute of this, Prince Eugen scored a hit with a high explosive round. The explosion started a large fire, but it was quickly extinguished. After about 3 4-gun salvos, Schneider on board Bismarck found the range to Hood, and he immediately ordered rapid fire salvos from Bismarck's 8 38-centimeter guns. He also ordered the secondary 15-centimeter guns to engage Prince of Wales. Lutyens also ordered Prince Eugen to shift fire and target Prince of Wales instead of Hood to keep both the opponents under fire. Within a few minutes, Prince Eugen scored a pair of hits on Prince of Wales. At 600 hours, Hood was completing a second turn to port that had been ordered by Holland, when Bismarck's 5th salvo hit. 2 of the shells landed short, but at least one of the 38-centimeter armor-piercing shells struck Hood and penetrated her thin deck armor. It's believed the shell reached Hood's rear ammunition magazine and detonated 112 tons of cordite propellant. This explosion wrecked Hood, breaking her back between the main mast and the rear funnel. The forward section continued to move forward briefly before the inrushing water caused the bow to rise into the air at a steep angle. The stern also rose as water rushed into the ripped open compartments. The actual exchange of fire in the battle had only lasted 8 minutes, and Hood was gone beneath the waves in less than 3 minutes. Out of her crew of 1,419 men, only 3 survived. The battle wasn't over though. With the Hood gone, Bismarck shifted fire to Prince of Wales, and she found her mark on her first salvo. One of the shells actually struck the bridge, though fortunately it didn't actually explode and exited on the other side, though this did kill everyone in the ship's command center, with the exception of Captain John Leach, the ship's CO, and one other man. The 2 German ships continued firing, and this caused serious damage. Prince of Wales was new, and wasn't quite ironed out yet. Her guns were malfunctioning, and she still had civilian technicians on board. Despite these difficulties, Prince of Wales did score 3 hits on Bismarck during the engagement, striking her in the forecastle above the waterline, but still low enough that crashing waves could enter the hull. The second shell struck below the armored belt and exploded on contact with the torpedo bulkhead, which flooded the turbo generator room and partially flooded an adjacent boiler room. The third shell passed through one of the boats carried aboard the ship, and then went through the floatplane catapult without exploding. At 6:13, Leach realized he was pretty much outmatched in this situation, and he gave the order to retreat. Only 5 of his ship's 10 14-inch guns were still firing. Prince of Wales had suffered significant damage. Prince of Wales made a 160-degree turn and laid a smoke screen to cover her withdrawal. Lindemann wanted to chase the Prince of Wales down, but Lutyens leaned on their operational orders, saying that they should shun any avoidable engagement with enemy forces that were not protecting a convoy. So he firmly rejected the request and Prince of Wales was able to escape. Bismarck, despite a significant victory in sinking the Hood rather easily in the grand scheme of things, didn't get out of the engagement unscathed. The forecastle hit had allowed nearly 2,000 tons of water to flood into her, which contaminated fuel oil that was stored in the bow. Lutyens refused to reduce speed to allow damage control teams to repair the hole, which only widened and allowed more water into the ship. The second hit had caused some additional flooding, but it was minor compared to the first. Shell splinters from the second hit had also damaged a steam line, but that wasn't a big deal since they had sufficient other generator reserves that could replace the one that was broken. The flooding from the hits caused a 9-degree list to port and a 3-degree trim by the bow. It wasn't something the Bismarck couldn't handle, but it was considered not good, especially given she was supposed to be out in the middle of the Atlantic doing raids. With this kind of damage, that probably wasn't advised, and Lindemann and even Lutyens did know that. At 8:01, he transmitted a damage report back to the Kriegsmarine, which explained his intentions to detach Prince Eugen so she could continue with the commerce raiding plan and to head to Saint-Nazaire for repairs. That was in occupied France. At 1000 hours, Lutyens ordered Prince Eugen to fall behind Bismarck and to determine the severity of an oil leakage that had started as a result of the bow hit. According to Prince Eugen, broad streams of oil from both sides of her wake were streaming out of the hole. After that, Prince Eugen returned to the forward position, and about an hour later, a British short Sunderland flying boat reported an oil slick to Suffolk and Norfolk, who were still trying to shadow the 2 German vessels. The damaged Prince of Wales was actually with the cruisers at this point. Rear Admiral Frederick Wake Walker, who was the commander of the 2 cruisers, ordered Prince of Wales to remain behind his ships. They protect. They attack. Not usually. They mostly shadow, lay smoke, and fall back. The Bismarck was put in a really bad spot, and the Germans may have been aware of this. Here's the thing about the Hood. She was a very well-known vessel, very popular among the general populace. She was old, but she was still well-loved. Her sudden sinking was a shock to the nation, especially given the tremendous loss the Navy had suffered. This painted a big old bullseye right on the Bismarck. There's a lot of navies where you can sink a boat and maybe they'll let you go. They won't take it too harshly. But the Royal Navy? Oh, they took that personally. Especially when it was the Hood. Prime Minister Winston Churchill directly ordered all warships in the area to join the pursuit of Bismarck and Prince Eugen. The hunt was on. So now the Bismarck had to get back to safe harbor under a Luftwaffe screen of protection before the Royal Navy was able to find her, all while leaking oil, which gave her position away. This was not a good spot, but she may have been able to pull it off. The decision was made, instead of going back the way they came, knowing full well the cruisers were still back there, was to actually go out into the Atlantic and then turn sharp and head toward France all the way around. In the open ocean, it'd be a lot easier to maneuver and stay relatively hidden. Not that the British planned on making this easy for them. By the morning of the 24th of May, the home fleet was actually steaming to intercept the German raiders, but they were still over 350 nautical miles away. As a result, the Admiralty had to order the light cruisers Manchester, Birmingham, and Arethusa to patrol the Denmark Strait, just in case the Germans actually decided to retrace their steps. They hadn't, though. The battleship Rodney, which had been escorting RMS Britannic at the time, was actually due for a refit in the Boston Navy Yard, joined Tovey's fleet instead, and 2 old Revenge-class battleships were ordered into the hunt. Revenge, out of Halifax, and Ramillies, which had been escorting convoy HX-127. In total, the ships that were searching for the Bismarck consisted of 6 battleships and battle cruisers, 2 aircraft carriers, 13 regular cruisers, and 21 destroyers, all committed to chasing 1 battleship down. By 1700, the crew aboard Prince of Wales restored 9 of her 10 main guns to working order. This permitted Wake Walker to place her in the front of his formation to attack Bismarck if the opportunity arose. But the weather worsened, and Lutyens attempted to detach Prince Eugen at 1640. The squall wasn't actually heavy enough to cover that, and Wake Walker's cruisers maintained radar contact. Prince Eugen was therefore recalled temporarily, but she was finally successfully detached at 1814. Bismarck turned around to face Wake Walker's formation. This forced Suffolk to turn away and flee. Prince of Wales actually fired at this point, 12 more salvos at Bismarck, who fired back with 9 salvos. Neither ship actually scored a hit. This action diverted British attention, and it permitted Prince Eugen to slip away without them realizing it. After this exchange, Bismarck resumed her previous heading, and Wake Walker's 3 ships took up station on Bismarck's port side. Despite the damage, Bismarck was still capable of reaching 28 knots, which was conveniently the maximum speed of Tovey's King George V. The British weren't going to be able to prevent her from reaching Saint-Nazaire. It just wasn't going to happen. There was no way they could intercept her at this point. However, the aircraft carriers might be able to help with this. If they could slow the Bismarck down, scoring a handful of hits, something, they might be able to catch up with her. Tovey detached the aircraft carrier Victorious, as well as 4 light cruisers, to shape a course that would position her to launch her torpedo bombers. And at 2200, Victorious launched the strike, which consisted of 6 Fairey Fulmar fighters, as well as 9 Fairey Swordfish torpedo bombers of the 828th Naval Squadron. They were led by Lieutenant Commander Eugene Esmond. But these aviators were kind of inexperienced, and they nearly attacked Norfolk and the U.S. Coast Guard cutter USCGC Modoc on their approach. This confusion actually alerted Bismarck's anti-aircraft gunners. She used her main and secondary batteries to fire at maximum depression to create giant splashes in the path of the incoming torpedo bombers that were flying extremely low. Here's the thing about the Fairey Swordfish. By this point, they were obsolete. They first flew in 1934 and were introduced in 1936, and they were biplanes. These kinds of aircraft were in desperate need of being replaced, but in their defense, for what they were actually extremely good and did an insane job during World War II, despite the fact that many other aircraft technically outclassed them. The other thing about them is that, well, they flew them very slow and very low. This created a lot of problems for Bismarck's anti-aircraft guns. They could only aim down to a certain point, and the gunners had been trained for a very specific kind of aircraft that had a certain speed. The slowness of the Swordfish may have actually confused them quite a bit. They were leading their shots way too much. The result was that actually none of the attacking aircraft were shot down. Bismarck did manage to evade 8 of the torpedoes though. The 9th, however, struck amidships on the main armored belt. This threw one man into a bulkhead and killed him, and it injured 5 others. It also caused minor damage to electrical equipment, but to be honest, the torpedo itself didn't cause most of the damage that Bismarck was suffering. The maneuvers that had to be done to evade the torpedoes, which involved rapid shifts in speed and course, had loosened collision mats, which increased the flooding from the forward shell hull and eventually forced abandonment of the port number 2 boiler room. The loss of this boiler, combined with the fuel losses and increasing bow trim, forced the ship to slow to just 16 knots, which might have allowed the British to catch up with them. However, divers were able to repair the collision mats, which allowed them to increase to 20 knots, enough that they may still have been able to make France if the British didn't slow them down some more. After the Swordfish left, Prince of Wales actually fired on the Bismarck again, with the Bismarck firing back, though neither scored a hit. Again, they're just throwing stuff at each other. Bismarck's damage control teams resumed work after that engagement. The seawater that had flooded into number 2 port side boiler was threatening to enter the number 4 turbo generator feed water system, which would have permitted seawater to reach the turbines, and that would be really bad. The salt water could easily damage the turbine's blade and reduce the ship's speed by a great deal. By the morning of the 25th of May, the danger had passed, though. The divers once again pumped fuel from the forward compartments to the rear tanks, and 2 hoses were successfully connected, and a few hundred tons of fuel were transferred. By this point in the pursuit, they'd entered open waters, and Wake Walker's ships had to zigzag to avoid the potential German U-boats that might be in that area. This slowed down their pursuit quite a bit, and after a few minutes of this zigzagging, Bismarck was out of range of Suffolk's radar. At 300 hours on the 25th of May, Lutyens ordered an increase to maximum speed, which by that point they'd managed to get back to 28 knots. They circled away from the west and then headed north. This maneuver coincided with the period during which the ship was out of radar range. The Royal Navy became frantic about the situation. They'd lost the location of the Bismarck. They didn't know where she was, and many of their ships were low on fuel. If she got back to port, they wouldn't be able to deal with her effectively. The Luftwaffe would keep them away. Not knowing exactly which direction the Bismarck had gone, Victorious and her escorting cruisers were sent west. Wake Walker's ships continued to the south and west, and Tovey continued to steam toward the mid-Atlantic. There was also another group, Force H, which had the aircraft carrier Ark Royal. They were steaming up from Gibraltar, but they were still at least a day away. Lutyens actually didn't know that he had shaken off Wake Walker, so he sent long radio messages to Naval Group West headquarters in Paris. These signals were intercepted by the British, which allowed them to roughly determine where Bismarck was. But they actually plotted them wrong. They thought Bismarck was heading back to Germany through the Iceland-Faroe Gap, and this meant his fleet was on the wrong course for 7 hours. When they realized the mistake, Bismarck had put a sizable gap between herself and the British ships. The British codebreakers were able to decrypt some of the German signals, and this included an order to the Luftwaffe to provide support for Bismarck. The French resistance actually provided the British with confirmation that Luftwaffe units were relocating there. The British now turned towards France to converge in areas through which Bismarck would have to pass. They used consolidated Catalina flying boats based out of RAF Castle Arkdale to comb the area, and at 10:30 hours on the 26th of May, one of those planes that was piloted by Ensign Leonard B. Smith of the U.S. Navy located her, some 690 nautical miles northwest of Brest. At her current speed, in less than a day, she'd be close enough to reach the protection of U-boats and the Luftwaffe. Most of the British force weren't close enough to where she was to stop her. They again fell back on the possibility of aircraft. Ark Royal was under the command of Admiral James Somerville. Ark Royal had her own Swordfish torpedo bombers, and those planes had already been searching nearby when the Catalina found the Bismarck. At the same time, Victorious, Prince of Wales, Suffolk, and Repulse were forced to break off the search due to their fuel shortages, and the only heavy ships remaining, apart from Force H, were King George V and Rodney, but they were too far away. It really was down to Ark Royal's Swordfish. The torpedo bombers also managed to find the battleship about 60 miles away from Ark Royal. Admiral James Somerville ordered an attack as soon as the Swordfish returned and were rearmed with torpedoes. He detached the cruiser Sheffield to shadow Bismarck, although Ark Royal's aviators were not actually told about that. Kind of mistook the Sheffield for the Bismarck and fired their torpedoes at her. Fortunately, they were equipped with new magnetic detonators, and those failed to work properly, so the torpedoes didn't go off, thank goodness, otherwise there may have been a massive, horrendous friendly fire incident. And in a way, it kinda helped, because upon the revelation that these magnetic detonators were faulty, they rearmed the Swordfish with contact detonators. This second attack comprised 15 aircraft and was launched at 1910 hours. At 2047, the torpedo bombers began their attack descent through the clouds, and as they did this, Bismarck, who had spotted Sheffield, fired at the cruiser. The shell fragments killed 3 men and wounded several others, and Sheffield ran away. His cruisers seem to be doing a lot in this story, but I don't really blame them for not wanting to go toe-to-toe with Bismarck. The Swordfish attacked, and Bismarck began turning violently as her anti-aircraft batteries engaged the bombers. One torpedo hit amidships on the port side just below the bottom edge of the main armor belt. The force of this explosion was largely contained by the underwater protection system and the belt armor, but there was some minor flooding. The second torpedo, on the other hand, was a bit more critical. It hit her in the stern, on the port side, and this was near the port rudder shaft. The coupling on the port rudder assembly was badly damaged by this, and the rudder became locked in a 12-degree turn to port. The explosion also caused a lot of shock damage. After the attack, the crew managed to repair the starboard rudder, but the port rudder would not move. They eventually suggested that they might be able to use explosives to just blow off the port rudder, but Lutyens didn't want to risk it, as damage to the screws would have left the battleship helpless. At 21:15, Lutyens reported that the Bismarck was unmaneuverable. She was only able to steam in a circle, and in her crippled state, the British moved in for the kill. Battleships King George V and Rodney were available to move in, along with heavy cruisers Dorsetshire and Norfolk. Sheffield continued shadowing the Bismarck, and even got shot at least once, though eventually lost contact. The main part of the fleet finally encountered Bismarck at 22:38 on the 26th of May. The Bismarck quickly engaged them with her main battery. She fired 3 salvos and actually straddled the Polish destroyer ORP Huron. Throughout the night on the 26th of May, Bismarck was hassled by a group of destroyers, and after daybreak on the 27th of May, King George V led the true assault on the Bismarck, with Rodney following off her port quarter. At 8:43, lookouts on King George V spotted her. 4 minutes after that, Rodney's 2 forward turrets, which comprised of 6 16-inch guns, opened fire. King George V's 14-inch guns also began firing. Bismarck returned fire at 8:50 with her forward guns, and with her second salvo, she actually straddled Rodney. However, after that, Bismarck's ability to aim her guns deteriorated. She wasn't able to steer, and she was moving erratically in the heavy seas. This robbed Snyder of a predictable course for range calculations. As the British closed in, the ship's secondary batteries joined in. Norfolk and Dorsetshire closed and began firing with their 8-inch guns. At 9:02, a 16-inch shell from Rodney struck Bismarck's forward superstructure. This attack alone killed hundreds of men and severely damaged the 2 forward turrets. It's also believed, according to survivors from the attack, that this salvo probably killed both Lindemann and Lutyens, though some contest that at least Lindemann may have survived, as they think they saw him on the deck as the ship sank. The main fire control director was also destroyed by that hit, and this probably also killed Snyder too. Basically, everyone important was either dead or incapacitated. It really was a bad situation all around, is what I'm trying to say. The second shell from this salvo struck the forward main battery, which disabled it, though it would manage to fire one last salvo at 9:27. Lieutenant von Mullenheim-Reichberg, who was in the rear control station, took over firing control for the rear turrets. He managed to fire 3 salvos before a shell destroyed the gun director, and this disabled all his equipment too. He gave the order for the guns to fire independently, but this largely did no good, and by 9:31, Bismarck had fired her last. Her 4 main battery turrets had been put out of action. One of Bismarck's shells exploded 20 feet off Rodney's bow and damaged her starboard torpedo tube, but that was the closest Bismarck came to a direct hit on her opponents during this exchange. With the bridge personnel no longer actually responding, the executive officer Hans Oyles took command of the ship from his station at the damage control central. He decided at around 9:30 to abandon the Bismarck and scuttle her to prevent her from being boarded and possibly captured. This would also allow the crew to abandon the ship and reduce overall casualties. He instructed the engine room crews to open the ship's watertight doors and prepare the scuttling charges. The British were still firing at this point, not willing to relent until they were sure the Bismarck had either surrendered or it was clear that they were abandoning ship. During this exchange, 4 ships had fired more than 2,800 shells at Bismarck and scored about 400 hits, but they were unable to actually sink her by gunfire alone. The heavy gunfire at virtually point-blank range had devastated the superstructure and the sections of the hull that were above the waterline, which caused very heavy casualties, but it contributed little to the eventual sinking of the ship. Rodney fired 2 torpedoes from her port side tube and claimed 1 hit, and if this is true, it means it's the only time in history where one battleship torpedoed another. The scuttling charges detonated around 10:20, and by 10:35 the ship had assumed a heavy port list. At around 10:20, the British were running low on fuel, and Tovey ordered the cruiser Dorsetshire to sink Bismarck with torpedoes and ordered his battleships back to port. Dorsetshire fired a pair of torpedoes into Bismarck's starboard side, one of which hit. Dorsetshire then moved around her to port side and fired another torpedo which also hit, but these torpedoes were largely unnecessary. With the scuttling charges already in place and the ship already listing so badly that her deck was awash, the Bismarck was done. She finally slipped beneath the surface at 10:40. Out of a crew of over 2,200 men on board the Bismarck, only 114 survived. The sinking of the Bismarck was heralded as a great victory for the Royal Navy. Though they had lost the Hood, they had gotten their revenge for her. The Bismarck robbed Germany of a massive piece of military technology, leaving only her sister ship Tirpitz to bring up the slack. It was also an embarrassment for the Kriegsmarine, and they didn't actually tell Hitler the Bismarck had been sunk because they were terrified. And, I get that, actually, that's fair. However, the legacy of the Bismarck and the story surrounding her sinking is one of the most well-known and commonly told stories from World War II, as well as one of the Royal Navy's finest hours. The idea of a battleship that in her day was viewed as sort of a super weapon would eventually be sunk due to an obsolete biplane torpedoing her in the rudder is kind of one of those David and Goliath stories that people are generally drawn to. Of course, this doesn't take away the fact that the Royal Navy did an impeccable job in chasing her down. Mistakes were made, sure, but they always made up for them and did everything they could to make sure the Bismarck didn't reach safe harbor. And she didn't. The wreck of Bismarck was actually located on the 8th of June 1989 by Robert Ballard. If that name sounds familiar, he's the same guy who found RMS Titanic. He found the Bismarck resting on its keel at a depth of approximately 4,791 meters. She'd actually struck an extinct underwater volcano. This caused Bismarck to slide down the mountainside and only coming to a stop about 2/3 of the way down. At the time, Ballard actually kept the exact location of the Bismarck a secret, as he was afraid other divers might take artifacts from the ship, which he personally viewed as a form of grave robbing. Based on Ballard's notes, as well as other expeditions to determine the exact cause of her sinking, and whether or not she could have stayed afloat had she not been scuttled, the answer is probably not. She would have taken a lot longer to sink, though. James Cameron, yes, that James Cameron, he loves underwater exploration, actually investigated the Bismarck himself, and when asked whether the ship would have sunk had the Germans not scuttled, he said, sure, but it might have taken half a day. The reason everyone was so hung up on this is because everyone really wanted to confirm that the British really had sunk the ship. Again, it was a source of pride for the Royal Navy that they pulled that off. And to be honest, to me, it's kind of a silly argument, because whether or not the British actually got the final blow on the ship, first of all, the wounds inflicted on Bismarck probably would have sank her anyway. And even if they wouldn't have, the wounds were the reason they scuttled her. So, I think the victory still goes to the British either way in this situation. And with that, a special thank you goes out to all my underwater train finders. Thomas Ward, Lord Captain Von Thrust III, Sumdude267, Orange Glass, Joshua Long, Ohio Trucker 1, Royal Hudson 2860, Lord Hawk 444, Arthur Roy, Benjamin Owens, Panzer Kitsune 131-232, Mr. Black Rose, Master of None, Josh Johnson, Lock Kraken, Twin Fox, Dimeblade 17, and Anzac A1. Till next time, this is Darkness, and I bid you all a fond farewell.